Hello, good evening, and a warm Yorkshire welcome from me, B. Hope you're all well. Thank you for tuning in, and can I just remind you to like, share and comment on this video. And this video is Unsolved Cases, Part 4. Enjoy! Some mysteries are full of twists and turns, which leave the police and the public confused and with more questions than answers. One of these kinds of unsolved mysteries is the case of the Yuba County Five. How did 5 men, coming home from a college basketball game, travel in the wrong direction and become lost in the woods in the mountains of California? Why did they walk away from their car in a snow-filled forest? Why were only 4 men found, and what happened to the 5th? Almost 50 years after they disappeared, what happened to the Yuba County Five is just as confusing as it was back in the 1970s. The Yuba County Five were 5 young men from Yuba City, California, who became friends while members of a local basketball team for people with mental disabilities. The eldest of the boys, as their parents called them, were Ted Wyher, 32 years old, who was described as showing signs of autism, and Jack Madruga, 30 years old, who was described as a slow learner. Bill Sterling was 29 years old and intellectually disabled. Jackie Hewitt was a 24-year-old man with unspecified physical and mental disabilities. The last member of the Yuba County Five was 25-year-old Gary Mathias. Gary was in the army, and while in West Germany he used drugs heavily. He was discharged from the army because he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Gary had been in and out of mental health institutions, but at the time of this story, he was being treated with antipsychotics and was said to have been doing well. Although the men did live at home with their respective parents, they were independent and some held jobs. Jack Madruga was also an army vet with a driver's licence and a beloved turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. The Yuba County Five had a basketball game on February the 25th, 1978 that they were excited to play in. Organised by the Special Olympics, the winning team would receive a free week-long trip to Los Angeles, and the boys were dead set on winning. On the evening of February the 24th, the Friday, the boys drove 50 miles north to Chico, California, to watch a basketball game between UC Davis and Chico State. Madruga drove off, and the Yuba County Five were never seen alive again. When the boys' parents noticed their sons had not come home, the police were called. They knew something was very wrong. The boys were so excited about their game that they would not have missed the game unless something had happened to them. Police began searching the route the Yuba County Five would have taken back from Chico, and there were no signs of the boys. This is when the whole case takes a strange and puzzling turn. A ranger from the Plumas National Forest had told investigators he saw a Mercury Montego parked along one of the roads in the forest on February the 25th. The ranger was not concerned, because residents in the area park on that road while spending the day cross-country skiing in the thick snow. Knowing that Madruga drove a Mercury Montego, the police went to investigate and found Madruga's car. Nobody knew why his car was there, or why the Yuba County Five were even in Plumas. Some of the Yuba County Five's parents told the police that there was no reason their sons would have gone that far into the mountains while it was snowing. The forest was over 70 miles northeast of Chico, opposite where the boys needed to go to return home. The car was stuck in a snowdrift, showing signs that the Yuba County Five tried to get the car free. However, the police felt that the 5 men, who were in good health, could have easily pushed the car out of the drift. When it was hot-wired, it worked without a problem and had a quarter of a tank of gas. The Montego was examined, and the undercarriage had 0 dents or scratches, even though the terrain was rough. Whoever drove the car into the forest drove incredibly cautiously or knew the area well. Madruga had never been to Plumas, and a search began. Unfortunately, snowstorms caused the search to be closed 2 days later, but the police asked the public for any information related to the missing Yuba County Five. In June, a group of bikers found a Forest Service trailer in a campsite, 19.4 miles away from where the abandoned Montego was found. Wyher's decaying body was found inside the trailer, and the scene around him was very odd. Wyatt's body was wrapped up in sheets on a bed, and his feet were frostbitten and gangrenous. Based on the length of his beard, the coroner was able to determine that Wyatt had lived as long as 13 weeks after he last shaved. The cause of death for Wyatt was determined to be hypothermia and starvation. This was puzzling because the cabin had a lot of matches, books for kindling, a butane tank for heat, and heavy forestry clothing. 12 army ration cans were found empty on the floor, but there was an untouched, dry food pantry with enough supplies to keep all of the Yuba County 5 alive for up to a year. Wyatt's family told police he lacked common sense from his disability, citing an incident where he had to be dragged from his bed while the ceiling was on fire. He stayed in bed because he was afraid he wouldn't get to work on time if he got up. Yet there was evidence that Wyatt was not alone in the trailer the whole time. Police believe Matthias and maybe Hewitt, who they had yet to find, were in the trailer with Wyatt. Matthias's shoes were found in the trailer, and it looked like the food cans that had been eaten were opened with a military P38 can opener, which only Madruga or Matthias would know how to operate the device from their time in the army. Police backtracked and started searching along a road that led from the Montego to the trailer, and found the scattered remains of Madruga and Sterling. Autopsies confirmed their death was caused by hypothermia. Authorities thought that one of the boys may have laid down to rest or sleep, which is a side effect of late-stage hypothermia, and it seems that the other boy stayed with his friend until he too froze to death. 2 days after Madruga and Sterling's remains were found, they found the remains of Jackie Hewitt. His father had come across some of his son's clothes, and upon picking them up, the backbone of Jackie fell out onto the ground. 4 of the Yuba County 5 tragically died in the forest. The real mystery is that Matthias was never found. We know he was in the trailer where he left his shoes, and it's assumed he took wires, which would have fit his frostbitten feet a bit better, but his remains have not been found after 47 years. This cold case is so intriguing because the reason and what exactly happened to the Yuba County 5 is still a mystery. Nobody could figure out why the boys were there. One theory was that the boys may have taken a side trip to visit some friends of Matthias's in a nearby town. The thought was that Madruga took a wrong turn and kept going straight ahead instead of turning round. However, police discovered that Matthias's friends hadn't seen or heard from him in over a year. Matthias could have kept walking after Hewitt died and was somewhere else. He was known for being able to travel long distances on foot. He had once walked over 500 miles after escaping the asylum he was staying at. With that in mind, police sent pictures of Matthias to the town hospital and morgue nearby, but nobody ever saw him. Matthias's mental health was brought up as a theory. Matthias was a paranoid schizophrenic and did not have his medication with him, which would have meant he began hallucinating and may have led the boys from the car in a deluded state. Matthias's stepfather believed that the only reason why the men in the trailer didn't build a fire was that they were afraid of being found. This case can be best summarised by the then Yuba County Sheriff Jack Beecham, who described it as bizarre as hell. In response to local media coverage of the case, police received several reports of some or all of the men being sighted after they'd left Chico, including some reports of them being seen elsewhere in California or in the country. Most of the reports were easily dismissed, but 2 of the sightings stood out. Joseph Shons of Sacramento told police he inadvertently wound up spending the night of the 24th of February to the 25th, near where the Montego was found. He had driven up there, where he had a cabin, to check the snowpack in advance of a weekend ski trip with his family. At 5:30 p.m, about 150 feet up the road, he too had got stuck in the snow. In the process of trying to free it, he realised he was beginning to experience the early symptoms of a heart attack and got back in, keeping the engine running to provide heat. 6 hours later, lying in the car and experiencing severe pain, he saw headlights coming up behind him. Looking out, he saw a car parked behind him, headlights on, with a group of people around it, one of which seemed to him to be a woman holding a baby. He called to them for help, but they stopped talking and turned their headlights out. Later, he saw more lights from behind him, this time flashlights, that also went out when he called to them. After that, Shons said at first he recalled a pickup truck parking 20 feet behind him briefly and then continuing on down the road. Later, he clarified to police that he could not be sure of that, since at the time he was almost delirious from the pain he was in. After Shons's car ran out of gas in the early hours of the morning, his pain subsided enough for him to walk 8 miles down the road to a lodge, where the manager drove him back home, passing the abandoned Montego at the point where he'd recalled hearing the voices originate from. Doctors later confirmed that he had indeed experienced a mild heart attack. Wyatt's mother said ignoring someone's pleas for help was not like her son, if indeed he had been present. She recalled how he and Sterling had helped someone they knew get to the hospital after overdosing on Valium. The other notable report was from a woman who worked at a store in the small town of Brownsville, 30 miles from the point where the car had been abandoned, which they would have reached had they continued down the road from where the car had been found. On March the 3rd, the woman who saw flyers that had been distributed with the men's pictures and information about the $1,215 reward the families had put up, told deputies that 4 of them had stopped at the store in a red pickup truck 2 days after the disappearance. The store owner corroborated her account. The woman said she immediately realised that the men were not from the area because of their big eyes and facial expressions. 2 of the men, whom she identified as Hewitt and Sterling, were in a telephone booth outside the store, while the other 2 went inside. The police said she was a credible witness and they took her account seriously. Additional details came from the store owner, who told investigators that the men, whom he believed to be Wyatt and Hewitt, came in and bought burritos, chocolate milk and soft drinks. Wyatt's brother told the Los Angeles Times that while driving to Brownsville in a different car, in apparent ignorance of the basketball game, seemed completely out of character for them. The owner's description of the 2 men's behaviour seemed consistent with them, as Wyatt would eat anything he could get his hands on, and was often accompanied by Hewitt more than any of the other 4. Hewitt's brother said Jack hated using telephones, to the point he would answer calls for Jack whenever he received any from the other men in the group. Whatever happened to the Yuba County 5, it's clear again that this is another case where we're left with more questions than answers. In what has become known as the Room 1046 mystery, a man calling himself Roland T. Owen checked into Room 1046 of the Hotel President in Kansas City, Missouri, on January 2nd, 1935. In just 2 days' time, he would be dead. When he was discovered in his room, he was already dying from his injuries sustained in what was obviously a brutal attack. The question was, who killed Roland T. Owen and why? But the man known as Roland T. Owen brought with him more mysteries than answers. His behaviour during his brief stay in Room 1046 was baffling to hotel staff and authorities alike. And as the investigation into his slaying continued, it soon became clear that even his name was a fabrication. Who was Roland T. Owen, and what happened to him in that room? We may never know all the answers, but the pieces of the puzzle are as haunting as any solution could ever be. When the man calling himself Roland T. Owen arrived at the Hotel President a little after 1 p.m. on January 2nd, 1935, he had some specific instructions. He provided a Los Angeles address, paid for just a single night, and requested a room facing the hotel's inner courtyard rather than the street. Witnesses later placed the man's age anywhere from 20 to 30 years old and described him as having a cauliflower ear, a common malady among boxers and wrestlers, and a scar on the side of his scalp, which he partially covered by combing over his hair. On the way up to his room, he didn't mention why he was in town. He did, however, complain that he had spent the previous night at the nearby Muleback Hotel and left after they tried to charge him what he felt was an unreasonable $5 per night. When Roland T. Owen, or whatever his real name may have been, arrived at the Hotel President, he had no luggage. Witnesses described him as neatly dressed, wearing a black overcoat. The only items he brought with him were a hairbrush, a comb, and some toothpaste, all of which were in his overcoat pocket. He placed all 3 items above the sink when the porter let him into his room. but all three would be gone even before Owen was. Hotel staff later observed that the man was a strange customer from the moment he arrived. Whenever maids or porters went up to his room, they always found it dark, with the shades drawn and a single desk lamp providing the only illumination. When Mary Soptic, a maid at the hotel, returned from a few days off, she found herself assigned to room 1046. When she arrived and found its occupant sitting in the dark, she offered to come back later, but the man told her to go ahead and clean the room. She later told the police that Owen seemed like he was afraid or worried about something, and that he always wanted to kind of keep in the dark. When the maid was first cleaning Owen's room, he told her not to lock the door, as he was expecting a friend in a few minutes. When she returned to the room later that day, she found Owen lying on his still-made bed, fully clothed, seemingly asleep. A note on the desk said, "Don, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." The following morning she overheard a brief phone conversation in which Owen said, "No, Don, I don't want to eat. I am not hungry." Later that afternoon, when she went to drop off fresh towels, she heard two men speaking in room 1046. When she knocked, a rough voice that she didn't recognise answered from the other side of the door, telling her they didn't need towels. In fact, the maid knew the room didn't have any, as she had taken them herself earlier in the day. In an ironic twist, the woman in room 1048, next door to the man calling himself Roland T. Owen, was Jean Owen of Lee's Summit, Missouri. She was of no relation to her neighbour, and indeed had no idea who he was. However, she later told police she heard noises on her floor throughout the night that consisted largely of men and women talking loudly and cursing. She considered calling the front desk, but never did. There was apparently a rather raucous party going on in room 1055 that night, which could have been the source of the disturbances. Jean Owen noticed, but that wasn't the only oddity. The elevator operator that night reported taking a woman who regularly frequented the hotel with different men up to several floors in search of a customer who was always very prompt. In spite of spending more than an hour looking around the place, it seems she never found him. On the night of January the 3rd at around 11 p.m, a water department employee named Robert Lane was flagged down in the street not far from the hotel president by a man matching the description of Roland T. Owen. The man Lane picked up was hurt. He had a bad scrape on his arm, and Lane suspected he may have had more serious injuries. He was also just in his shirt sleeves, despite it being a January night in the middle of Kansas City, and thus not exactly clement weather. "You look as if you've been in it bad," Lane said when the man asked him if he would take him to find a cab. The man's reply, "I'll kill that bleep tomorrow." The newspapers at the time didn't print the expletive the man uttered, so we'll just have to use our imaginations, just as we can only guess who he may have been talking about. On Friday morning, the day after a man matching Owen's description was picked up in the street by Robert Lane, the operator at the hotel noticed that the phone in room 1046 was off the hook. She dispatched a bellhop to see what was going on. The bellhop arrived at the room and found the door locked with a "Do Not Disturb" sign. After knocking repeatedly, he finally heard a deep voice on the other side of the door telling him to come in. With the door still locked, however, the bellhop knocked again. "Turn on the lights," the voice said this time. Unable to get into the room, the bellhop simply shouted, "Put the phone back on the hook," and returned to the lobby. About an hour later, the phone was still off the hook, so a different bellhop, Harold Pike, went up to the room and knocked. Receiving no answer, he used his passkey to unlock the door, indicating that it had been locked from the outside, and saw its occupant lying in bed naked. Pike later told police that he noticed what appeared to be dark shadows in the bedclothes, but that he assumed the room's resident was simply drunk. He replaced the phone on the cradle and went back downstairs, locking the door behind him. After a long morning of dealing with room 1046's phone being off the hook and its guest being naked and passed out on his bed, the hotel operator was frustrated to once again find the phone off the hook a few hours later. She sent Randolph Probst, the same bellhop who had initially taken Owen up to his room 2 days before, back up to sort the problem out. He knocked on the door, got no answer, and used his passkey to open it up. On the other side, he found a badly injured Owen on his hands and knees a few feet from the door. When he turned on the lights, he saw that there was blood everywhere. When authorities arrived in room 1046, they found Owen on the brink of death. He had been tortured and stabbed, and they later determined that many of the bloodstains in the room were hours old, meaning he'd already been attacked before the first bellhop found him, seemingly unconscious on his bed. Owen went into a coma shortly after reaching the hospital. While he was still conscious, the only explanation he offered for his grievous injuries was that he fell against the tub. He died in the hospital that night. In the wake of Owen's death, police published a sketch of him in the paper under the heading, "Do you recognise this man?" It seems that whoever he really was, the man who called himself Owen, had checked into the hotel under an assumed name. One part of his story was true though. He had been at the Mulebeck the night before. While the staff there didn't have any guests named Roland T. Owen, they did recognise the sketch of the deceased, who had checked in there under the name of Eugene K. Scott, also from Los Angeles. Of course, the problem was that the police could find no missing people of either name from Los Angeles, nor anyone else missing from LA who matched the man's description. The real identity of Roland T. Owen was as much a mystery as what had happened to him. Besides Owen himself and a distressing amount of blood, almost nothing was left in the room to show that he or anyone else had ever been there. Owen was naked and all of his clothes were missing, along with the handful of items, brush, comb and toothpaste, he had brought with him to the room. There was also no sign of a weapon that could have inflicted the injuries Owen had suffered. In fact, the only items in the room were a hairpin, a safety pin, an unlit cigarette, a bottle of dilute sulfuric acid, and a tie label that said it was from Botany Worston Mills. There were 2 glasses in the bathroom, one on the shelf, the other broken in the sink. The police found 4 small fingerprints on the telephone stand that they thought might have belonged to a woman, but they were never identified. Though several people attempted to identify the body of Owen, no one was able to. Authorities were preparing to bury him as a John Doe when the funeral home received a call. The unidentified caller asked them to hold off, promising to send enough money to give Owen, or whoever he was, a proper funeral. Within a month, the funeral home received an unmarked envelope containing enough cash to cover all the expenses. The unidentified man was laid to rest in Kansas City's Memorial Park Cemetery under the name of Roland T. Owen, with no one in attendance but police. However, there were 13 American Beauty roses laid on his grave. The roses were purchased by an anonymous caller who said he was doing it for his sister. The caller promised $5 for the trouble. The roses were accompanied by a note that simply said, "Love forever, Louise." A year after the events in room 1046, a woman recognised a magazine photo of the man who had called himself Roland T. Owen. She said the man was her son, Artemus Ogletree, who had left home when he was 17. While authorities ultimately concluded she was probably right, this produced its own set of mysteries. For one, Artemus Ogletree was much younger than anyone had believed Roland T. Owen to be. For another, Mrs. Ogletree had received several letters, ostensibly from her son, and one phone call from someone who said he was a friend of Artemus. One of the letters and the phone call claimed her son was in Egypt, and all of them had been sent after Owen was already in the ground. The identification also did nothing to shed any light on why he'd been killed, nor the identities of the other players in the mystery, such as Don and Louise. In 2003, John Horner, a librarian at the Kansas City Public Library, received an anonymous phone call. The caller said they were going through the boxes of a deceased individual when they found newspaper clippings about the mystery in room 1046. What's more, the caller said the box also contained something mentioned in the newspaper clippings, but never said what that something was. To this day, the truth behind what happened in room 1046 remains unknown. The latest notes in the police department cold case files, dating back as far as the 1950s, simply say, "I will continue to pursue the investigation." And that brings us to the end of another week. Thank you again for tuning in. Please don't forget to like, share and comment on this video. Hope you have a really good week. Hope to see you next week. Until then, take care, stay safe, stay happy, stay lucky, and most of all, stay spooky.